Hello and welcome to another pattern recognition video. We are going to be looking at a strategic pattern in this one. Kind of, a strategy that you can, well, hopefully try to spot in your games and apply. And this video will help you identify these opportunities when you have them. But before we go on, I have a puzzle. So this position, one of my favorite puzzles, was shown to me probably almost 20 years ago by Peter Heine Nielsen, who was the assistant of Magnus Carlsen. He was playing from a club, the Reykjavik Chess Club, and he showed this puzzle. And he mentioned that he had shown it to very strong players like Morasevich, who was world number 2 around that time, and some others, and they had difficulty solving it, or they needed a lot of time at least. And the puzzle is white to move and make a draw, and in fact it's after white's first move it should be clear that it is a draw. Now I've shown this to a lot of people and they always try to make something work with the knight discoveries, and I'll give you a hint, it is a knight discovery, but perhaps not the one you immediately think of. But okay, we'll get back to this position towards the end of the video. But now let's try and understand this pattern that we're trying to learn. So first, a very extreme position, but one that is easier to understand and dissect. It's white to move, and it should be clear that we are going to make a draw here. We're down a lot of material. Obviously this is not a very plausible position, but one that's good to illustrate, what we're talking about. So in this position, it's obvious that white is going to get a draw by simply checking the black king. The black king has no way to escape. It's blocked here on the 6th rank by its own pawns, and it's clear the rook is going to be able to check back and forth because it is covered by the king. So the king covers the rook. That's important. But that's not a theme, that's kind of the setup for the theme. What I want to talk about is rook perpetuals with 3 or 4 files where the rook is giving the perpetual, so more than the 2 that we just looked at. And for that to happen, in this case, it's 3 ranks, the 8th, the 7th and the 6th. We need a few things. First of all, we need some kind of barrier for the king. In this case, it's the pawns. It could also simply be a white rook on this rank covering these squares as well. And then, and most importantly, we need these squares to be covered somehow because of the abilities of the rook. If the black king gets close enough, it can attack the rook. So we need either the king to be away from the green squares or the rook to be covered when the king comes to the green squares. In this case, we have a rook, and this should be easy to understand because the rook is behind the rook. We are able to give a perpetual check, and there's no way around it. In the previous position, even though it was only 2 ranks, we could have moved these pawns up 1 rank, and the queen maybe as well, and the king would be able to cover all these squares for the rook to give checks. So the king can cover 3 ranks. Becomes slightly trickier when it's 4, because then you need more than a king, and usually more than a minor piece. So we're going to explore some of these things. First, we were looking at it kind of from the side. It can also be like from the top, using files. In this case, the rook is covering the barrier, which now is on the side, and this guy is going to be handling all the checking on these squares. This should be a clear case as well. It's going to be a check, check, check. There's no way around it. The rook covers the rook. So this is a perpetual as well. So it can be from either side. It's important to understand that. Now, okay, moving on to 4 ranks. And the rook is trying to give perpetuals. And in this case, we have a minor piece helping out, the bishop. and here the bishop is covering the rook on these squares, but we need more. And fortunately we have this pawn here covering this square, because as we know, when the king arrives, the rook needs to be covered. So okay, let's start making checks because we want to make a draw. The king naturally starts approaching, and fortunately for us, there's a barrier here. This could be, you know, in many ways. I just make it a barrier like this so it's clear, but it could be like a white pawn somewhere, it could be a white king somewhere. We're just setting up kind of an abstract situation and try to identify the key pieces. We'll move on to more plausible examples and in fact examples from played games, so it's all clear. So the king tries to approach. Like we said, obviously it can't get shelter anywhere around here, so it tries to approach, but we give checks. King approaches, we give checks, and let's start here. The king comes here, but fortunately we have the bishop covering this, so we can give a check. The king goes up, we have the pawn giving checks, covering the rook, so we can give a check. Same here, we have the bishop. But now comes the only tricky part. We are not covering this square, which we would be if we had a pawn here, a king here, a knight here, bishop here. But fortunately, because of the strength of the bishop, we can make a discovered attack, discovered check. Rook somewhere, check. The king has to move, and then we can keep checking. And it's a perpetual check. So the bishop can help, provided it has help in covering the rook on the vulnerable square. Similarly for a knight, the knight has some, well, nice properties, different properties, but in this case, it's also a draw. We cover this key square, which will become vital. So again, the barrier here, which we can't pass through. Abstract, so we understand it completely. So here we have a check. The king tries to approach because it can't go here, so it has to approach the rook. And now we see what happens. Because of the abilities of the knight, it is covering these squares. If it wasn't, the king could approach here, and there would be no check on these squares. But because of the knight, the king can't approach. So it can only approach on this square, but then fortunately we have this pawn covering the rook, and that's vital for this perpetual to work. Okay, king goes back, check, and again it can come here, but now again the knight comes into play. It's covering this square, so we can give a check, also covering this square, so the king can't approach, and the check goes on endlessly. So now I think we can move into some, well, practical examples, and in fact we just might as well go back to the original puzzle at the start of the video, and I think you'll be able to solve it now, because it's a combination of two examples of what we just looked at, and it's more than 4. It's in fact 8, which is unbelievable. So the key move here is, and I'm guessing you found it by now, is to play knight to h6 check. So most people try to make this work, you know, some kind of knight discovery, but it's clear that the rook over here and the knight, we're not going to be able to give mate or get a perpetual with the king out in the open there. But however, going here, we are fortifying this pattern that we're trying to learn, and now we see, okay, there's no shelter for the king behind the pieces here, and there's no shelter this way, because we're blocked simply by the length of the chessboard. We don't need anything, you know, he can go down here, but nothing further, you know. This is sort of Antarctica, you know, beyond this point, the South Pole, you're not getting anywhere. So we can only try to approach, so let's not mouse slip, let's go here, but we keep checking. And we've already seen this. Check, we can't approach because of the knight. So let's try to come here, but now we remember the knight is covering here. So okay, can't go here because of the knight. We can't go here, but the pawn is covering, very important. Again, if we had a rook here, this will be easy and more understandable. And let's keep going, check. We were here, let's try to go here, but now we have the knight covering. Let's try to go here, but now we move on to where the king is covering, just like in one of our first examples, this one, the king is covering the rook, and it can cover up to three ranks. So going back here, we're going to be able to check here, and the king is covering the rook. So we're simply going to give perpetual checks on the g-file. Similarly, this could be done with a bishop. So here black is in check, king d7, and we've seen this before. Here the rook is covered. If you go here, we give a discovered check, covering the bishop, importantly, because of this. And then we just keep checking. Here, covered by the pawn, check. Here, discovered check. And if you go down, we have the king covering on these three. So, okay, fine and dandy, but is this practical? Well, I will give you some examples. First one is from a game played between Ding Liren and Nodirbek Abdusattorov. Now in this position, Ding has played knight d4, 4 king, both rooks. No, Abdusattorov played rook here, check, and Ding could have got a winning position with king g6, which I'm not really going to get too much in. Well, let's have a quick look. In the game, king f6 and king g2 happened, giving up the rook. Now, king g6 is actually winning, because on king g2 we can play rook d7, attacking this and still attacking this. And it's very important to attack this, because it's the key piece in the perpetual pattern that we are looking at. The rook perpetual, it needs assistance to be able to check on 3 or 4 ranks or files, and the bishop is key. So why does it work here with king g6 and not king f6? Well, on king f6, king g2 has happened in the game. If we now play rook here, we can play rook here, check. That's the difference. There are more details, but not relevant to our pattern, so let's not delve into it. In the game, Ding did take the rook. Rook takes c2. But this now ends in a perpetual, because this square is covered, we have a bishop, and then we can use a discovered check mechanism to keep the checks going. So a check was given, check on e5, covered by the bishop, check on e6, covered by the pawn if the king is on f6, check on e7, covered by the bishop, and now king g8. Now the king could go to f8. In that case, we could keep on checking with rook e6, getting the perpetual, or rook anywhere actually, but we could also try to play on and simply take the rook, because we are up a pawn. So king g8 happened in the game, but then Abdusattorov just kept on checking, and there's no escape for the king. The reason why this pattern sort of came on my radar again was because of this game right here. This is a game where my uncle was playing, Kjartan Mok was playing in the same tournament as I was. I was looking at this game. Very exciting game, which he won. And in this position, white has, well, an incredible save, really, which was pointed out by the computer. We thought this was, well, basically probably winning for black. I mean, knight c3 is incoming. There are other ideas, and white pieces are generally a bit loose. But white can play the incredible move, rook c6 here. Now what's this? Looks like sorcery, because we can play knight c3. We can. But white has a trump up his sleeve. He will take this knight. Well, actually he has to, because this is mate. But the reason why this works is fantastic. And again, now we're using our pattern, 4 files in this case. So the rook will give checks on h6, g6, f6, and e6. And because of the properties of the knight, the king can't approach, so rook f6 will make a draw. We can't approach, we can't run over here, no shelter, check, covered by the pawn, check, and we can't go here because rook d6 check, and white will not lose that because after takes, he's going to pick up the pawn. We have an outside passer, and probably we win here, although I haven't counted. Well, that's outside the scope of this video. Yeah, finally, a last example. It's more trickier. It kind of utilizes the same property. We want to give perpetuals on 3 or 4 ranks or files, and we get some assistance. In this case, the assistance is rather unusual. If we had a rook here, then this would be easy. We would simply take, this will be covered by the rook, and then we just keep on checking, and the rook on h5 would cover the other rook. In this case, the cover of the rook is more abstract or tricky. We can't take the rook because c4 check, and then we pick up the queen. So the rook can't be taken. And in fact, it still can't be taken. If you take the rook, check, take the queen. Here, can't take because check, take the queen. Same thing, you take, check, take the queen. So it turns out this is a perpetual and a very unusual cover of the rook. We can go over here, but we keep checking, and this is actually six files, the perpetual, but a perpetual it is. So hopefully you learned more about ways in which you can get a perpetual check with a rook. I gave you some ideas. If you have the 2 heavy pieces lined up, it's usually easy to find. But if you have the right arrangement of minor pieces and usually a pawn or a king to help you out, these opportunities can be available, and they can save you a game here and there. And that's why we try to keep learning these patterns, because we never know when they will help us, but eventually they will. And that's why we're here. So hope you enjoyed it. See you in the next one. Bye bye.